In the last module, we learned about the official U.S. poverty measure. In this module, we will discuss in more detail some of the concerns about the adequacy of that measure and why many have proposed alternative measures to better track progress against poverty and to track the effectiveness of anti-poverty programs. Any single poverty measure will always be subject to criticism. In particular, there will probably always be room to argue over whether the poverty threshold or line is drawn at the right level to accurately reflect lack of access to essential needs. Similarly, it's likely to remain controversial what is and is not counted as income. For the official U.S. measure, given its long history and use for administering many key programs, such criticisms are not uncommon. This brief video clip from the TV show The West Wing illustrates some of the potential for controversy.
Sam?
Yeah.
Are you guarding my office?
It's funny.
Thank you. Yeah?
On Monday, the OMB is putting out a new formula for calculating the poverty level.
I saw that. Does it need presidential approval before it goes to Congress?
Yeah.
What's the problem?
It's a good news, bad news thing. Under the new formula, poverty is up 2%. It was anyone under 17,524 before. Now it's 20,000.
What does that shake out to?
4 million new poor people.
4 million?
Yeah, obviously that's the bad news.
Yeah?
The good news is that more people will be eligible for benefits.
And taxpayers are nuts about that. Let's get back to the bad news. 4 million people became poor on the president's watch.
They didn't become poor. They were poor already. And now we're calling them poor.
What was wrong with the old formula?
I don't know.
Find out.
It's possible that this is a statistical reality and not a political fight.
Well, get with someone at OMB and find out what was wrong with the statistical reality of the old formula.
Yeah.
Do it today.
Yeah.
It's like when they did the thing with the SAT scores and I got dumber 20 years after I went to college.
It's a little like that.
Talk to somebody?
Yeah.
Hey, Sam.
Sam.
Yeah.
Bernice Collette.
Thanks.
Hey, Sam.
How you doing, Bernie?
Not wild about people calling me Bernie.
Sure. What should I call you?
Bernice is fine.
But how will you know I'm your buddy?
I'm okay living in the dark on that.
Okay. Can you tell me how the current standard was reached?
The new one?
The current one. The new one hasn't been signed off on.
We have to sign off on it.
Why?
It's much more accurate.
How was the old one reached? The current one?
In 1963, an Eastern European immigrant named Molly Orshansky, who was working over in Social Security, came up with it. Food was the most costly living expense where she came from.
Our cost of living formula for the last 40 years has been based on life in Poland during the Cold War.
This is what I'm talking about. I mean, food doesn't account for 1/3 of a family's budget. Housing is more expensive than food. The current model also doesn't take into account transportation and health insurance. So let's call the current model the old model and sign off on the new model.
All right. Sit down. She's making a certain amount of sense.
Isn't this one of those things that can be argued from all sides?
Yes.
And in one way or another, they're all right?
Yes.
You can put the numbers together a lot of different ways?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's put them together in a way that gives us fewer poor people.
Yeah.
Or if we have to go with the new formula, delay as long as we can, we have to test it.
All right. So 3 statisticians go deer hunting. The first one misses 10 feet to the left. Second one misses 10 feet to the right. The third one jumps up and down and says, I hit it. You gotta like a guy who comes with a statistical analysis joke. Certainly you would if you had let me call you Bernie.
Sam.
Shouldn't we test the math before the president signs off on it? Create a pilot program, experiment for 2 years?
Test the math.
Yeah.
You think we did this with an abacus?
You know, I've always wanted to learn how to work an abacus. Because on the first date, when the check comes and you pull that thing out of your pocket, start adding up the tip?
Well, that and your statistics jokes will have you blazing a path through the capital women.
Yeah. You know, the new formula doesn't take into account regional differences in housing costs.
No.
You don't think it's worth it?
We took the national mean.
How do you suppose landlords in New York and LA feel about the national mean?
We debated that, but agreed it was too difficult to assess when the costs change from year to year.
So you drop the problem when the math gets tough.
Look.
You know who wouldn't be very pleased by that? Miss Holly Orshansky of Poland, author of the original formula, who I think is long overdue for recognition.
Molly.
Hmm?
Molly Orshansky?
Not Holly?
No.
The U.S. official poverty measure has been subject to more detailed concerns, however, beginning in a formal way as far back as 1995. In that year, the National Academy of Science issued a careful and detailed report that pointed out many serious shortcomings of the official measure. For many years after that, however, there's been no change in the official measure, largely because this is a highly contentious issue. Why is that? An important part of the issue involves the recognition that many government benefit programs and their eligibility rules are tied to this measure. Thus, there's always been widespread concern that any dramatic changes to the official measure could also lead to changes in eligibility for and spending on government benefits. To preview the next module, in 2011, the U.S. Census Bureau did take an important step toward revising our official measure. They did this by formalizing a new supplemental poverty measure. That measure addresses many of the concerns with the existing measure, including those noted in the 1995 report. The Census Bureau's supplemental poverty measure, however, is not meant to replace the official measure, but simply to provide an alternative supplemental measure. For now, let's consider in more detail some of the major concerns with our official measure. First, as we learned, the official measure does not count all resources available to support families' needs. It looks only at the level of cash pre-tax income, and so ignores many benefits specifically intended to help poor families, including SNAP, housing assistance, tax credits, and Medicaid, or health care for low-income children and families. Now, in theory, it's possible that a poverty measure could informally take account of the fact that not all resources are being counted. For example, if we know some resources will be systematically missed by a cash income measure, we might simply set the threshold a bit lower to acknowledge that families will have other non-cash resources to help meet their needs. The problem with such an approach, however, is that if only some families have these extra resources, any informal adjustment of that type will not work very well. A similar and important issue arises if the relative amounts of cash and non-cash assistance change over time. In the U.S., this issue of changes over time in the way in which benefits are delivered, cash versus non-cash, has become a critical issue. The graph shown here shows the trend in spending per person, adjusted for inflation, from 1980 through 2010 for a variety of government assistance, tax, and social insurance programs. Let's focus specifically on the solid blue line, which shows spending under traditional cash welfare programs, AFDC, and later TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. Beginning around 1995, the amount of resources given to low-income families as part of these cash welfare programs, which are, of course, counted in the official poverty rate, began to decline significantly. In contrast, over the same time period, income going to poor working families through the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, or through food stamps, and represented by the black circles and the dashed blue line on the graph, increased substantially. These benefits are not included in our poverty measure as income because they operate through the tax system or are restricted to certain types of consumption. With this in mind, imagine a hypothetical low-income family in 1995 who simply traded off welfare benefits dollar for dollar with EITC benefits. According to the official poverty measure, this trade would actually have increased measured poverty because the welfare benefits were included as income, but dollars received through the EITC are not. This exact type of situation plays out frequently in public policy debates, though often in a more subtle manner than in this stark case of a single hypothetical family. Specifically, it's very common to ask, why hasn't poverty decreased over the past several decades? And note the substantially increased spending on programs for the poor over the same time. A recent criticism of this sort of spending for anti-poverty programs is shown here and takes exactly the same approach. The writer notes, quote, "In 1965, we launched a war on poverty, and as this graph shows, in the years that followed, the portion of Americans living in poverty barely budged. That's after spending $15 trillion on anti-poverty programs," end quote. This statement is technically correct, but it really only has impact if we think that most of that $15 trillion in spending is actually being measured in our official poverty measures. In fact, much of that spending is not counted in the official poverty measure, even though it may be reaching and helping poor families. So by definition, these dollars cannot show up in our official statistics as reducing poverty. A second problem often noted with the official poverty measure in the U.S. is that our poverty threshold remains fixed in real terms, which simply means adjusting for inflation, even over periods of tremendous economic growth. Whether this is a problem or not is debatable, but it highlights the difference between an absolute and a relative poverty measure. An absolute poverty measure, such as the official poverty measure in the U.S., measures, as we've said, whether individuals have enough resources to meet a fixed set of basic needs. An alternative is a relative measure of poverty, which captures the fraction of the population that has relatively few resources, income, wealth, or consumption compared to others in that society. For example, in the United Kingdom, individuals are considered poor if they have less than 60% of median income in the country. With relative measures of poverty, as economic growth over time pushes overall income and overall GDP higher, the poverty line will rise as well. With an absolute standard, that's not the case. To see this, let's consider the U.S. poverty line over time as an example. In 1965, U.S. real per capita or per person income in 2014 dollars was approximately $21,400 per year. By 2012, that measure of per capita income had more than doubled in real terms to about $45,000. At the same time, the official poverty line remained constant over the whole period. That means that the poverty line for a family of three, about $18,750, in 1965 was roughly 87% of per capita income, but by 2012 was just 42% of per capita income. Economic growth over time means that income per person rises, but using an absolute poverty measure means that the poverty threshold will remain constant regardless of that economic growth. Many have argued that this means that poverty in the U.S. today is a more severe or extreme condition relative to our typical living standards than it was 50 years ago. This point centers around changes in the meaning of our poverty threshold over time. But there's another concern with the official poverty measure that focuses on whether it accurately reflects comparisons across different geographic areas in the U.S. at a single point in time. Recall that the current U.S. measure applies the same needs standard based on a simple food budget to all parts of the U.S. The problem with this is that $1 in San Francisco, California, for example, may not go nearly as far as $1 in Biloxi, Mississippi. There's substantial variation in the cost of living across different parts of the United States, and our official poverty measure ignores this. If the basic cost of living differs across areas, but we use the same poverty measure everywhere, we are effectively applying different standards across different areas. A uniform measure across the entire United States may underestimate the number of individuals who will struggle to get basic necessities in expensive areas and overestimate this number in less expensive areas. For example, in Austin, Texas, the cost of living is approximately 31% lower than the cost of living in Davis, California. This means that you'd need about $35,000 in Austin to have the same standard of living you would have on $50,000 per year in Davis. A final common concern with the official U.S. poverty measure is related to its definition of resources or income. Because we want a poverty measure to provide information about a family's ability to secure basic necessities, it may be important to consider whether some of their income is required to go to particular types of expenses. The obvious example we've mentioned before here are taxes, which are legally required to be paid to the government. If, after all, a family has just enough income to meet basic needs, but then needs to pay part of that income to state, local, or national tax authorities, they may not have enough disposable income after taxes, to secure those necessities. Besides taxes, medical and work expenses are also sometimes considered non-discretionary expenditures. A poverty measure that does not subtract the necessary cost of working or required medical expenses may overstate the resources available to support a family to purchase food, shelter, or clothing, especially if the parents are working. Medical expenses and work expenses may be parts of income that we want to subtract when measuring for income for poverty. These and other reasons prompted the Census Bureau to develop this new supplemental measure of poverty for the United States. We'll talk in more detail about that measure in the following module. Given all of these and other concerns about the official measure, however, it's worth a final word on why this measure has been so resistant to change. As hinted at in the video clip you watched, it can be very controversial to change the poverty measure, partially because it is likely, almost guaranteed, to either increase or decrease the number of people currently considered poor. An even more important issue, however, is that whenever we are measuring and tracking poverty, a major use of those statistics is to allow for comparisons over time. Changing our official poverty measure will break the comparability of our poverty statistics, and so there's a cost to making this change, even if everyone could agree that the current measure isn't ideal. To compound this problem, some of the improvements we might want to make in our poverty measure, and that we could make with currently available data, aren't possible to make with data that would have been collected in the past. This means even if we wanted to, we simply can't always go back and reconstruct comparable poverty rates using a new measure. This explains to some extent why the measure has been so tough to change and why it remains with us today.